Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And today we are looking at German POW policies with a slight focus on Romania, but not just Romania. My guest penned a chapter for the German-Soviet War Combat Occupation Legacies, which is the book we're discussing this week and again in 2 weeks' time after we go back to Norway next week. The link to the book is in the description below, or you can find it at your local bookstore or wherever you get your books. And he is an active participant in many World War II history groups in the USA and Europe. I'll bring him in now. So good afternoon. How are you today, Dallas?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. So as a first-time guest, I always like to kind of ask people, what their background is and how you define yourself: pure military history, social history, Holocaust historian, and also how you came to write a chapter for Jeff's book.
Right. So I'm a historian at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. I primarily work on the Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos project there. And when I started doing that, I was working on Volume 4 of that project, which was published in 2020, which deals primarily with sites that were operated by the German Wehrmacht, which mostly means prisoner of war camps, as well as internment camps for civilians and stuff like that. So that was how I became interested in the issue of prisoners of war. Previously, I had mostly researched things like forced labor, which I wrote a book on that was published a few years ago. But I became interested in the issue of prisoners of war, particularly Soviet prisoners of war, through working on that project. And when I was giving a presentation on our findings on Soviet prisoners of war at a seminar at the museum in January of 2020, so right before the world ended, I ran into Jeff Rutherford, who I've known for many years, and he said, "Hey, we're putting together this volume. Would you like to contribute a chapter on prisoners of war, maybe something focused on Romania, because we don't have much coverage there?" So, that was how I was brought into the project. I guess I would say I'm mostly a Holocaust historian. I'm certainly not like a military historian by training. I've sort of had to gradually become one as I've been working on this project, because now I'm working on, in addition to this, I'm working on my own book project on Soviet prisoners of war, which, which I know y'all will be talking about tomorrow with Maier as well. And
indeed. And thank you for giving us the background of your credentials and career there. And you talked about, just mentioned the POW camps, internment camps, labor camps. One of the things I knew anyway, but it's been reinforced by hosting this channel, is that those labels seem like they're convenient themselves to put things on, but I've discovered the boundaries and the definitions get a bit complicated. We think even with death camp, extermination camp, transit camp, camp where people died in large, is that it's obviously not a hurdle to doing the studying, but does it make it awkward to kind of set your parameters up and say, okay, I'm studying this bit, does that bit fit in or does that bit not fit in?
Yeah, that's something that I've encountered in the process of working on this project, which has been going on for 25 years, well before my time. I mean, they've been working on this so long that I had hair when they started. But so that's something that's really struck me, is how many camps have multiple lives, you could basically say. How camps that start out as an internment camp for political prisoners get repurposed as a forced labor camp, get repurposed as a concentration camp, get repurposed as a prisoner of war camp. You have pretty famous examples of this, like, for example, the very well-known Bergen-Belsen concentration camp was actually originally a camp for Soviet prisoners of war, Stalag 311. So you have many, many examples of this. Things like Auschwitz-Birkenau, the extermination camp. That was originally a labor camp for Soviet prisoners of war. So there are lots and lots of examples of exactly what you're talking about, where these boundaries are fluid and these camps are continually repurposed for lots of different purposes over the courses of their lifetimes.
Yeah, we're planning a show on Norway, one of the camps, or several of the internment camps near the Norwegian Bergen, as opposed to the Bergen-Belsen Bergen. And I think one of them was an orphanage first. Then it was for Norwegian prisoners captured by the Germans in '94. Then it was Soviet prisoners. Then it became Norwegian collaborators and traitors at the end of the war. So, within 5 years, it had like 4 purposes, and I've probably forgotten another 4 or 5 it had as well. So it does get complicated. But we're going down a rabbit hole of talking about language and definitions. But I'll bring up your slides now. So, folks, this is about the POW experience. But as we've learned already, the boundaries of what is and isn't different types of camp we'll discover. And there's a bit of a focus on Romania, but also the basic kind of Axis policy. So over to you, sir.
Right. So I wanted to start with kind of a top-down, high-level overview of the Axis prisoner of war camp system. I'm going to start more with Germany, and then we'll get into Romania in a little bit. So the German camp system, this comes, by the way, from the new open access version of our project, the Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos, that's just gone up with Project Muse a couple months ago. You can see that there are just huge numbers of these camps, mostly obviously concentrated within Germany proper, but there are large numbers of camps in Poland, as well as camps within the occupied Soviet Union and to a lesser extent in France and Italy. So the German prisoner of war camp system, basically the organization of it and the prisoner of war policy is dictated by the 1929 Geneva Convention, which is the document of international law that's in force at the time of World War II. Germany, as well as all of the Western Allied countries, are signatories to this document. The Soviets are not, which we'll get to in a moment. That will become important. The prisoner of war camp system is under the Wehrmacht High Command, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, or OKW. It's managed within that by the Allgemeine Wehrmachtamt, or the Army General Office, Abteilung Kriegsgefangenen, or the Kriegsgefangenenwesen, which means the prisoner of war section or prisoner of war service. And this is reorganized a few times during the war. I won't get into all the details of that, but that's who is essentially managing this. There are several categories of camps, which this map doesn't show. When you look at the interactive version of this, you can play around with that and find that. You can't see it on this map, but there are several types of camps. The largest number and the best known ones that people are probably familiar with are the main prisoner of war camps, the Stalags, which are camps for enlisted men, and the Oflags, or Offizierslager, which are the camps for officers. And this division of officers and enlisted men was required by the Geneva Convention because there are different provisions that apply to both groups. For example, officers can't be compelled to work. They can only work on a voluntary basis, while enlisted men and non-commissioned officers can be compelled to work. We'll see. The Germans violate this frequently when it suits them. But right, so you have the main prisoner of war camps. Most of these are located within Germany proper and within occupied Poland. You also, when you look at listings of the prisoner of war camps, you'll notice that some are numbered with Roman numerals and some are numbered with Arabic numerals. The ones that are numbered with Roman numerals are camps that hold all groups of prisoners of war: Western Allied, French, British, American, Soviet, Polish, Serbian. These were numbered based on the German military districts. I should have included a map of that. I don't have a map of that. But the Roman numerals correspond to the German military districts where the camps are located. And then you'll encounter camps with Arabic numbers like Stalag 1, Stalag 301, Stalag 302, etc. Those are camps that were exclusively for Soviet prisoners of war.
Right.
So they're also sort of transit camps that are basically intended as temporary sites. These are not all shown on this map. You have a large number of these camps over here in the Soviet Union. These would be transit camps, which are known as Durchgangslager or Dulags. And then you have camps in France that are referred to as Frontstammlager or Frontstalags. And these were both intended to be temporary housing before the prisoners could be sent back. Basically, the way this would work is the prisoners are captured on the battlefield. They're taken to a divisional collective point and then taken to these transit camps. On the Eastern Front, because of the larger sizes of the territory involved, there's a couple of intermediate steps, what's known as an army prisoner collection point that collected prisoners from the divisional collection points. Then they're sent to the transit camps, and then they're sent back to the main camps. There are also some complicated administrative divisions that go on the Eastern Front that I'm not going to get into in detail here. But one last thing I would note is that once the prisoners arrive in the Stalags, they are the actual populations of the Stalags are much lower than what you would see on paper, because the Stalags essentially function as hubs for forced labor. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of labor units, which are referred to as Arbeitskommandos, that are attached to each of these Stalags, and they go out to This could be anything from dozens of prisoners working in a factory to 1 or 2 prisoners being sent out to work on a farm. And there are just dozens and dozens of these. A German colleague told us while we were working on the encyclopedia that if you counted every site where a prisoner slept for one night, you would have a 7-digit number of sites. So
wow.
This is an enormous. You see the scale on this map, and this doesn't even give you anywhere near the full scope.
Just a quick question for you. Is there
Absolutely.
any link with the camps the Germans had in the First World War? Because I'm thinking of the war movie cliche of the German commandant where British RAF prisoners, whatever, always says, yes, I was a prisoner myself in the First War. I was up near Manchester. So was there any kind of textbook, doctrinal type of kind of changing of you mentioned the Geneva Convention of 29 there, but is there any connection other than the fact that they had camps in the both wars between the two setups and organizations?
Not really. I will say that is realistic in a sense, just because the generation of people who were the camp staff, the camp officers, like the commanding officers and stuff in these camps, a lot of them were of that generation, the World War I generation, more or less, So guys who would have been, like 40 years old or 45 years old at this time, too old to be sent to the front, but had military experience. They had, whatever rank. So they were used as the commanding officers of the camps. As far as direct links, not really, not at least as far as I know.
That's what I guessed. I mean, I'm glad and I'm sure you're going to expand on this. That you mentioned the forced labor, because that's the whole connection that to me makes it set different from the other wars. This is all connected with economy and logistics and that kind of aspect of it, which I don't really think of when I think of the First World War. But back to you. Thanks for answering that.
Yeah, and the forced labor aspect, I'm going to talk about that again with Romania. That's something I get into a lot in my chapter, actually. But the forced labor aspect, this is a reflection, I think, of the new style of war that's being fought, like this idea of a total war, both in our sense of the word and in the sense of like the totale Krieg that's fought by the Germans, in the sense that Erich Ludendorff used the word. Where you're really mobilizing all of the resources of the state, as well as all of the resources ultimately of the occupied territories, in the interest of the war effort. There's actually a little bit of controversy with that when it comes to Soviet prisoners in the German case, and I'll get into that. I'm sure y'all will get into a lot more detail on that tomorrow, but I will mention that in a moment. So really, I think the key point to understand about Axis prisoner of war policy, and this applies to both Germany and Romania, although it's a little more extreme in the German case, is that the experiences of individual prisoners of war are strongly dictated by the nationality of those prisoners and by the perceived racial group that those prisoners fall into within the Nazi racial hierarchy. The differences between Western Allied prisoners of war, French prisoners of war, British and Americans, the treatment of those prisoners and the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war is night and day. Broadly speaking, the British and Americans are sort of at the top of this hierarchy. The French and Belgians are just below them. The Serbs and Poles fall in kind of a middle area. I should note that the Polish prisoners of war were mostly released in 1940. They weren't actually released, but they were converted to civilian status and made civilian forced laborers. But in the initial phase, they're kind of in this middle tier. Below them are the Italian military internees, as they're known, the people who refused to fight for the Germans after the armistice in September of 43. About 1 million of those guys were interned. And then the Soviet prisoners of war, of course, are at the bottom. So, and you can see this play out in the death rates for those prisoners. For the American and British prisoners, the death rates are on the order of about 1%. For the French prisoners, something like 2 to 3, roughly equivalent for the Belgians and the Serbians, maybe a bit higher for the Poles. And then about 6% of the Italian military internees in German captivity died. And then about 58% of Soviet POWs in German captivity died. So again, it is a night and day difference. And this was strongly conditioned, by racial and political ideology. Just to kind of drive home the point here, during the peak period of mass death of Soviet POWs, which was roughly from October of 41 to January of 42, more Soviet prisoners died on an average day during that period than American prisoners and British prisoners died in the entire war. About 8,100 American and British prisoners died during the war. The average was well above that during that period of mass death for Soviet prisoners of war. Another factor that I would point out is whether or not those countries held German prisoners of war, because obviously the prospect of retribution against German prisoners of war did to an extent put a constraint on the treatment of prisoners of war by the Germans, particularly in the case of the Americans and the British, since they held decent numbers of German prisoners. Obviously, the Polish state is completely destroyed, same for the Serbian state and for the French state, more or less, so that they don't have that kind of leverage against the Germans. The Germans behave with more impunity in their treatment of those prisoners of war, even in the case of the French prisoners, who are deemed to be more racially desirable by the Germans, essentially. And I should note that this is not, even within the national groups, the treatment of prisoners is not uniform. People who were members of racial minorities are treated worse generally. This is particularly the case for French colonial troops, particularly troops from West Africa, who were sometimes subject to mistreatment by the Germans. Raphael Scheck has done some very good work on this, if you're curious about that. And then Jewish prisoners were not subject to being killed generally. There are cases late in the war where American Jewish prisoners are sent to a fairly infamous forced labor camp known as Berga, which is a subcamp of the Buchenwald concentration camp system. But as a rule, they faced discrimination and some mistreatment by the Germans, but not like a program of systematic mistreatment. Now, the exception is Soviet Jewish prisoners, and I will talk about that in a moment. But and then one last point I should make here is that conditions for all national groups of prisoners, regardless of nationality or race or whatever, deteriorated during the last months of the war as the German infrastructure, the German military administration, the supply lines and so forth start to break down. So you have mass starting to have hunger among the prisoners who were treated well during the first months of the war. I have a few photos here. This photo of a German officer interrogating Polish prisoners. As I mentioned, the Polish prisoners had it a bit rough early in the war because they were essentially had to build their own camps. Like the Germans just had these fenced-in areas with barbed wire and a bunch of tents. And the Polish prisoners over the first few months of the war basically had to build their own camps. So they had it pretty rough during those early months. And like I mentioned, in 1940, most of them were converted to civilian status and sent to forced labor without the restrictions of the Geneva Convention, which, limited things like being able to use them in military production or in areas where they might come under fire, things like that. So that removed those.
Just to touch on what you said about the last year of the war. We've done shows about the death marches, and Holly Harris particularly talked about the 8th Air Force prisoners of war out in the East, and the lack of food, the lack of logistics, but also the fact the Germans are losing the war. At the beginning of the war, when they're winning, I guess there's a slightly better mood amongst the camp staff and people like that. And I suppose as the years pass and the situation is changing on the front, add that with the shortages, I guess that would have influenced things as well. Just a general downturn of mood.
Absolutely, yeah. If you read the reports of prisoners of war and stuff like that, they'll say that the attitudes of the Germans, you notice a shift. The Americans will often say, you notice a shift after, not only after D-Day, but after the after the Battle of the Bulge, after the Soviet breakthrough in the East in January of 45, you start to get, you notice the changes in the German attitudes and stuff like that. So at that point, to some extent, it is out of the camp commander's hands, because they, can't make food appear out. They can't make food appear by magic if the food's not getting delivered. But at the same time, they do, and especially for the camps further east where you have the death marches and stuff like that. So, I just threw in a few photos here. Here's Himmler reviewing a group of French prisoners of war. who, like I said, were generally treated more or less according to the principles of the Geneva Convention, although they were used for forced labor in applications that violated the Geneva Convention, particularly in arms production. A group of British prisoners of war here. This is Stalag 4A in Elsterhorst in central Germany. And a group of American prisoners at Stalag Luft 1 in Bad in eastern Germany. Mm. And then a group of a couple of French colonial prisoners here with German prisoners. Like I mentioned, there's, they had some worse experiences that white prisoners from metropolitan France did not. And there are instances of the Germans summarily executing French colonial prisoners. There are obviously incidents of mistreatment of prisoners of all groups. You have the Stalag Luft 3 murders, you have the Malmedy massacre, you have other examples, but generally prisoners of American, British, French nationality are not subject to systematic mistreatment. We're talking about a big difference between isolated incidents and the systematic mistreatment of Soviet POWs.
How does the Geneva Convention work with regards to prisoners of any nationality volunteering to do things for extra pay, for extra rations? You said that the officers aren't allowed to work, and but if, for example, you get offered extra rations to work in a munitions plant, I don't know whether that ever happened or not, but how would the Geneva Convention protect you if you, as a prisoner, decide to do something voluntarily?
If you chose to do it voluntarily, I think you're, I'm not a lawyer, but I would think that you are more or less surrendering whatever protection you had by law because you volunteered. You chose to do that. The point of the Geneva Convention is that you can't be compelled to do it.
You can't be forced. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah. And then I have this photo here of Jewish prisoners of war eating, celebrating Hanukkah. And so even Jewish, Western allied Jewish prisoners were not subject to the kind of systematic mistreatment that Soviet prisoners were. So like I said, I know y'all are going to do Soviet prisoners in a lot of detail tomorrow. I know Maris works on it a lot from the Soviet perspective. We're friends. We've known each other for like 10 years. She works on it more from the Soviet perspective. I work on it more from the German perspective, and I want to give some context for what I'm going to talk about with Romania. So I'm going to talk about this, again, as a broad overview, and I'll let y'all get into detail on it tomorrow. Although if people have questions about it for me, I can also answer those.
Okay.
So like I mentioned, unlike the Western Allied POWs, the Soviet prisoners are subject to a program of systematic mistreatment. 58% of Soviet prisoners in German captivity die. So out of according to the German statistics, about 5.7 total Soviet prisoners of war, 3.3 million of them die. And 2 million of those deaths occur in the first 8 months of the war. So of the prisoners, the Germans took about 3.35 million Soviet prisoners in the first year of the war. By the end of 41, over 2 million of those died, so over 60%. So we're talking about mass death at just unimaginable proportions. People, at the end of 41 and by the spring of 42, right before the final solution to the Jewish question begins, actually Soviet prisoners of war, the Germans had killed more Soviet prisoners of war at that point than Jews. And by the end of the war, the Soviet prisoners are still the second largest victim group of Nazi Germany. So this happens partially as a result of poor strategic decisions and poor planning, logistical planning on the German part. Obviously, the failure of the campaign in the East, the Germans don't really make detailed logistical plans for the possibility of fighting a long war. Once that, happens due to the failure of Barbarossa, the failure of Operation Typhoon, they find themselves in a logistical crisis, a supply crisis, a food crisis. And that is certainly part of what happens. Some of the more apologetic accounts claim that the Germans weren't prepared for the number of prisoners. They didn't have the ability to feed these prisoners. That's demonstrably not true. They handled 2 million French prisoners of war in a much shorter period of time just the year before. So that's not true. Some of it comes down to German policy in terms of food and the occupation of the Soviet Union, the economic policy intending to exploit the resources of the occupied Soviet Union. They want to send that food back to Germany. And it becomes a matter of prioritizing who gets that food. German troops at the top, obviously, German civilians next, then Soviet civilians, and then Soviet prisoners of war at the very bottom. And then, of course, racial and political ideology factors into this, right? We're talking about a war that's explicitly conceived as a war against Judeo-Bolshevism, against the Soviet system, that's tied deeply into anti-Semitic ideology, that's inseparable from Nazi anti-Semitism and what ultimately becomes the Holocaust. So you have all of these things working together to produce this just unimaginable mass death. And I should mention that the vast, vast majority of these deaths are by starvation. You have literally thousands, if not tens of thousands of people starving to death every single day during the last months of 41 and the first months of 42. So you also have things like disease and exposure to the elements, because many of these camps, the Durchgangslager I talked about, these are essentially just open fields. These are open areas that the Germans have fenced in. They've put basically no effort into building sanitary facilities, housing, kitchens, anything like that, basic infrastructure. They're just in an open field like this. And you see these guys are just kind of standing out there in an open field. And that's basically what the Germans called a camp. And that's the case for so many of these Durchgangslager, because these camps moved frequently. The idea was for them to be transit points to the rear, so they kept moving as the front advanced. So the Germans would have to pack up and move these every few weeks during the first few months of the war as they're rapidly advancing.
And we had a question earlier on from Gordy about where did they march the 650,000 Soviet prisoners they encircled at Kyiv. And I remember reading something, I think earlier today, about moving them around constantly is also another kind of way of pretending to justify the fact that some of them died. So, well, we know we weren't really treating them bad. They couldn't keep up with the war, So is it partly the movement? Is it also a reducing the number policy as well as just moving them?
Not necessarily a deliberate policy. It's not necessarily a method of killing,
right,
but it becomes a huge source of mortality. And more to the point, the prisoners who survive it are in very bad shape. Yeah. So by the time they reach the camp, that amount of marching, because we're talking about dozens of miles to reach these camps, the gaps, as the front expands, these gaps become enormous. So these people, even the ones who, survive these marches, which are often, days out in the heat or the freezing cold with very little food, very little medical care for wounded prisoners. Yeah, the people who survive these are in horrible shape by the time they get to these camps that are barely camps. And so, even the healthiest, strongest prisoners often died in these horrible conditions, much less those who were already weakened from these very long marches. And this is less of an issue, I would say, in Kyiv than, say, the prisoners who were taken, say, around like Smolensk or the later battles at like Vyazma and Bryansk. Those prisoners march a long way in very bad weather conditions. As far as that huge number of prisoners from Kyiv, you have at least some camps in that area. The Germans do have some Durchgangslager, as well as ultimately a permanent camp, which would be Stalag 3. Oh, I should know this off the top of my head. It's 356. 346. It's one of those. It's in a neighborhood called Darnitsa, which is near Kyiv. But that was one of the main places that they took those prisoners. But ultimately, what they would do is just keep moving them west through this series of Durchgangslager until they reached permanent prisoner of war camps. So those prisoners ended up ultimately in a variety of camps. Some of them ended up back in camps in occupied Poland or Western Ukraine. But what ends up happening is that as the German logistical system breaks down in 41, starting not long after the conclusion of the battle at Kyiv, as the transport system breaks down, they have to dedicate whatever functioning rail, truck, whatever transport they have to transporting ammunition and fuel to the front. And that's what they choose, and food for German soldiers. And that's what they choose to prioritize, not transporting food for Russian prisoners or transporting the prisoners to the rear. So what happens is a lot of these transit camps become de facto permanent camps, and the prisoners stay there for months. And because these camps are so primitive, this just leads to enormous death rates, because these camps aren't, they're barely camps in any sense of the word. And I should note here that I know Maris is going to get into that more detail on that tomorrow. She's done some good work on the prisoners who are left in Russia. But I should note that even in the German Reich, about 40% of the prisoners who are sent there during the first months of the war die. Because again, the camps there are also fairly primitive. They were only given a few weeks notice to prepare these camps. So a lot of them are just like, they basically built a fence around a military parade ground. Maybe they threw up some barracks, a couple buildings for the camp administration, and that's about it. So even
just to
within
recap
Germany,
a few things there. Sorry to interrupt you, Dallas. So that, you made the very clear point that the apologist argument of they weren't prepared to get these number of prisoners, that we've debunked that. Of course, they knew they were going to be taking those prisoners, and as you said, they had been dealing with even more numbers of French prisoners earlier, a year earlier. At the same time, there is this thing that Ed said yesterday about the fact that the Barbarossa plan, it's not so much the bullets and the oil and the fuel and stuff they're worried about, it is the food. And when things start bogging down the front, the food becomes the primary cause. And then as you're starting to add there, the logistics problems start in there. But that we're starting to move into kind of giving the Germans excuses again for, well, it wasn't really their fault. So we had a question from Roderick, which is pretty blunt but fair to ask. Was the extermination, if we call starvation extermination of Soviet prisoners, done in order to further Lebensraum doctrine? I mean, is this part of the ideology? You're saying it's definitely not an accident, but can we go as far as saying, no, this has been built into the plan from the beginning? They've always understood that the deaths of Soviet prisoners of war would be part of this.
So this is a controversial question. I should note that the historiography of this subject is pretty limited in English. The German historiography is pretty well developed. You have some people like, say, Christian Gerlach, who argue very strongly for the existence of a premeditated sort of hunger plan, right? This idea that we're going to starve huge numbers of people to death, and that this is going to create space for German colonists. And what Gerlach argues is that this was obviously not fully implemented because the Germans lost the war. They never got the chance to really do this, and it may have been impractical as it was planned anyway. But because the Soviet prisoners were in camps and they couldn't go anywhere, they couldn't, a Soviet peasant could walk to another town and look for food if he needed to. A prisoner can't do that. He's stuck in a camp. He's at the Germans' mercy. If they don't give him food, he starves to death, period. So they become the way Gerlach would argue for it, but they become the primary victims of this hunger plan. Other historians, say Christian Hartmann, they argue for, I guess, you could almost analogize this to the functionalist versus intentionalist debate in Holocaust studies, that this is more of the Germans responding to a crisis. And it's still a deliberate decision. It's still a deliberate decision not to give food to the Soviet prisoners, but it's more of a response to the crisis that they find themselves in the fall and winter of 41, rather than something that was premeditated. And I think that there are valid points in both arguments, and this is an ongoing debate among historians who study this topic. So
yeah, and the same thing happens in that we had Sarah Kovner on a couple of years ago talking about Japanese prisoners of war, and that particularly, Australians, British, who had incredibly bad treatment of our POWs by the Japanese in World War II. There's this, we hold on to this idea that it was all deliberately cruel, and it was, and there obviously was lots of that. But Sarah makes the point that a lot of it was that the Japanese just didn't have the food, they didn't have the infrastructure, they didn't have the organizations. They're not excusing the brutality and the barbarism, but trying to explain it on a more deep understanding of it. And I guess that's broadly what we're discussing here. There's as you say, intention or it's murder or accidental homicide, whatever, that kind of thing. It's negligent. It's language again, isn't it, in how we interpret the terms.
Yeah, and I want to be clear on whether you consider it more active, premeditated murder or negligent homicide. I do want to be clear on one point that, like the questioner said, yes, this is very much conditioned on ideology, because whether you're talking about a premeditated plan to annihilate 30 million people so that you can colonize their land, or simply a pragmatic decision about who gets food and who does not when you're in a food crisis, both of those things are fundamentally conditioned on ideology. They're fundamentally conditioned on who the Germans determined to be worthy of life and unworthy of life. And
that's very good.
Whenever that question comes up, the Soviet prisoners of war are going to be at the very bottom. They're always going to be last in line to get food or medical.
I'm glad you made that point, because you're reinforcing what you said earlier. It's that the status of these people has already been decided. They are at the bottom of the absolute bottom of the food chain, and if they survive or don't survive, no one really cares at a high level. So regardless of what happened to them, that's important to take on board, that they've already been disregarded as equal with equal rights, I suppose.
Yeah. I want to get to Romania. I do want to make two other kind of points here. One, a couple that are important for what we're going to talk about with Romania. One, there are groups even within this with the Soviets at the bottom that are at the very bottom. That would be one, the political commissars. I would guess a lot of people are probably already familiar with this, but on June 6th of 41, the OKW issues the Commissar Order, which calls for the execution of captured Soviet political commissars. And originally the apologist accounts would say, this wasn't really carried out. We didn't actually do this, but now we know that the vast majority of German units did in fact carry it out. 90%, if not more, carried out the order. And then Jewish prisoners of war. Initially, there was not an order to kill all Jewish prisoners of war. This process was altered in July of 41. Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the Sicherheitshauptamt, who's the head of the Sicherheitsdienst, and you have the Einsatzgruppen operating on the Eastern Front alongside the German military, who are responsible for the execution of Soviet Jews. And ultimately, they are being sent into the prisoner of war camps to select commissars, and ultimately to select Jews and other people who are deemed undesirable, like members of the Communist Party, party functionaries, intellectuals, broadly defined. And they take these people out of the camps and they shoot them. If these people survive long enough to get to the camps in Germany, they're taken out by the Gestapo and they're generally sent to concentration camps and executed. But in the Soviet Union, they're executed by the members of the Einsatzgruppen. And I wanted to point that out to get to the point that this is a process of radicalization. The people who are subject to this policy of deliberately being shot are growing during the opening weeks of the war. And what you have happening at the same time is the radicalization of German Jewish policy. You have the move from executing men of military age to executing women and children to executing entire Jewish communities within these first weeks and months of the war. So you have a parallel process of radicalization in policy towards prisoners of war or Soviet prisoners of war, I should say, and Jews. So this is another good example of how the conduct of the war in the East is completely inseparable from the conduct of German Jewish policy in the Holocaust. These are driven by the same ideological factors. They're driven by, in many cases, the same actors and the same policies. They happen in parallel. They intersect with one another in some cases. They are inseparable. So I think that that's an important point to emphasize. And then one last thing I want to mention is that after the spring of 42, German policy towards Soviet prisoners of war shifts. They shift from allowing them to die en masse to exploiting them for forced labor. Now, they're still treated much worse than other prisoners of war. Another 1.3 million or so die in the last 3 years of the war. But they are fed better, housed better, broadly speaking, so that they can be exploited for forced labor. Hitler makes this decision in October of 41. He had made the decision in August of 41. He had prohibited the Wehrmacht. The Wehrmacht and the economic authorities actually wanted to bring large numbers of POWs to the right because the Germans were short like 1,000 people, 1 million people in the war economy before the invasion of the Soviet Union began, much less, once they started to have to mobilize more and more men to fight in the East to replace their losses. So they need labor. And you have millions of prisoners of war who could come to work, and Hitler says no. He sets a cap on, at the beginning of August, he says no more than 120,000, and he doesn't reverse this policy until the end of October. And this is decisive for the fate of the Soviet prisoners, because by the time he says at the end of October, okay, let's bring them to the Reich to work, the vast majority of them have either starved to death or are in the process of starving to death and can't be used for labor. The Germans only have about 166,000 Soviet POWs who are fit to work during the winter of 41-42. And interestingly enough, this also leads to a more intensive exploitation of Jewish forced labor. Prisoners in the concentration camps are exploited more heavily to make up for that deficit, as well as you have the recruitment of the so-called Ostarbeiter, civilian forced laborers from Eastern Europe, from Poland, and from the occupied Soviet Union. So again, this is a good example of what we were talking about at the very beginning, how the treatment of different groups intersects, and the treatment of one group drives policy towards another.
Yeah, and we had a question from William about, he said these were essentially the lucky Soviet POWs, I mean, quote unquote there. Do you have any statistics on how many Soviet POWs were shipped to concentration camps and not stalags? And we're into that,
right.
The complication of classification again there, because again, I would want to say, well, clearly in some cases, Jewish Soviet prisoners were separated, but is it as neat as that?
No, there's so you have two different groups of prisoners who are sent to concentration camps. I should say that the exact numbers are not perfect. We don't have exact numbers, probably on the order of 100,000, though. We would, it's definitely in the tens of thousands, if not 100,000, or possibly, 120,000. But there are two different groups of prisoners, Soviet prisoners, who are sent to concentration camps. The first are the groups we mentioned, Jews, commissars, others who are slated. And they're sent there, and generally they're executed either on arrival or immediately afterwards. The second group would be the so-called Arbeitsrussen, or work Russians, who are sent to the camps as part of a request from Himmler to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht starting in October of 41. And he initially wants something like 50,000, and then he says 100, and then he says 125, 150. He doesn't get anywhere close to that. He gets like 25,000. About half of these are sent to Auschwitz. Another, few thousand are sent to Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, Majdanek, Gross-Rosen, and a couple of other camps. I believe Dachau, and then a couple of others. They're sent there essentially for forced labor, but these prisoners also die very quickly. One thing, and like I said earlier, that's why you have the foundation of Auschwitz II, Birkenau, which eventually becomes the extermination camp. That's established as a forced labor camp for Soviet POWs, but because they die so quickly, it's never used for that purpose. But I should note that because those prisoners were dying so quickly, the Germans were having to, the SS still had to report their deaths back to the Wehrmacht so that the Wehrmacht could record it for record-keeping purposes. And they had so many of them dying so quickly that they couldn't keep track of them. So what they started doing was tattooing their numbers across their chests so they could identify the bodies quickly. And this evolved into the infamous practice of tattooing prisoner numbers on their arms. So this is something, again, that starts with Soviet prisoners of war and then leads into the persecution of the Jews.
Thank you.
Yeah, you can see here they marked Jewish prisoners with the star markings to essentially mark these people for execution. So after however long that was, finally get to Romania as promised. This is a map of the Romanian camps. The camps that are in the blue arrows are camps for Soviet prisoners. The two in the green are the camps for American prisoners. Later, there's an American prisoner camp in Bucharest as well. So Romania commits more troops to the front, the Eastern Front, than all of Germany's allies combined. They're a dedicated supplier of oil to the Axis war machine. They provide somewhere between a quarter and a third of Germany's oil during the war. So they're an important ally for Germany. And along with Finland, they're one of only two German allies who held significant numbers of Soviet prisoners. The Italians, of course, also had some American prisoners, but not Soviet prisoners. The Romanians, participate in the initial invasion of the Soviet Union. Romania captures about 91,000 Soviet POWs. About 9,000 of these are released before they're ever officially registered. So they end up with about 82,000. Another 13,000 or so people who are ethnic Romanians from the occupied territories that are like present-day Moldova now, as well as ethnic Ukrainians are released to their homes. So the remaining 70,000 or so are brought back to Romania to the camps. And I should note that Soviet POWs, again, in Romanian captivity, died at a much higher rate than Allied prisoners of war. The Soviets had about, of those 82,000, about 5,000 died. So we're talking about 6%, a slightly higher percentage if you factor in the fact that a lot of those early prisoners were released before they reached the camps, but still nowhere close to the 58% that died in German captivity, or even the 30 or so percent that died in Finland. So this is already a pretty stark contrast. I should note that none of the American prisoners of war who survived into captivity ultimately died in captivity in Romania. Any of the Americans who died in Romania, were either killed when they were shot down or died of their wounds rather than dying in captivity. So I should note that obviously there's some differences between Romanian attitudes towards these two groups of prisoners of war. Romania is, the Romanian leadership. This is a right-wing authoritarian government under Ion Antonescu. This is not, in my opinion, I would not characterize it as a fascist government. Some people make that argument. I personally don't agree with that, but in any case, it's a right-wing authoritarian government that's aligned with the Nazis, that's in agreement with the decision to invade the Soviet Union, commits large numbers of troops to the invasion of the Soviet Union, 2 full field armies, the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies, which are ultimately mostly destroyed at the Battle of Stalingrad. So they commit these large numbers of troops. They're very much involved. The government holds anti-communist, anti-Slavic, anti-Semitic ideologies, not necessarily Nazified versions of these ideologies, but they're aligned with the Germans ideologically in a broad sense. So they have similar attitudes towards the Soviet prisoners. And yet Soviet prisoners died at a much lower rate. And I looked at, Romanian prisoner of war policy to see what would be the explanation for this. So Romania, like Germany, is a signatory of the Geneva Convention. They based the treatment of prisoners of war in their 1937 field regulations on the Geneva Conventions. You will hear, if you look at the Council of Ministry meetings, Antonescu saying, we have an international law obligation to treat these prisoners correctly, but his motives, I don't think, were humanitarian, given the character of his regime, the fact that, they largely disregarded international law in many other cases. I'm sure most people are aware of this, but Romania was responsible for the deaths of more Jews during the Holocaust than any country other than Germany. At least 250,000, some authors estimate close to as much as 400,000. So huge, active participant not only in the war, but in the Holocaust. So not buying any argument that they're really motivated by humanitarian concerns here. The one real big difference that you see in Romanian prisoner of war policy versus German prisoner of war policy towards the Soviet prisoners is that the Romanians send the Soviet prisoners to work right away, basically. As soon as they arrive in the camps, they're assigned to work. Even in early July 41, you have prisoners being assigned to work. And this is something that you see a lot in those Council of Ministers meetings and stuff when Antonescu was talking about, we've got to do better. And later there's, the first months of the war, the conditions are not very good in these camps. They're pretty primitive, a lot like the German camps. The prisoners don't have great housing. Food is inadequate, not to the degree it was in Germany, obviously, but not great conditions. People are dying mainly of typhus during this period, more so than starvation. But you have fairly significant numbers of deaths in the early months of the war. After spring of 42, the death rate tapers off significantly, both because conditions didn't improve and because the Romanians are able to develop the camp system a little bit more, so the infrastructure is better. In November of 41, Antonescu appoints a special, a person who's in charge of prisoner of war affairs. This is a guy named Colonel Ion Stănculescu. He is basically the commissioner for prisoner of war affairs. He gets his own section within, under the Romanian general staff to administer prisoner of war affairs. And under his leadership, the system develops and becomes more organized, so they're able to supply the camps better, and the death rate for prisoners decreases significantly. So any prisoners who survived those early months of the war were very likely to survive until the end of the war. And like I said, the main feature of this that's different from the German camps, in addition to the lack of this mass starvation that you see in the German camps, is the fact that so many Romanian prisoners are sent to forced labor right away. They're sent out to work, and the Romanians therefore have this incentive to keep them healthy. And they talk about this, Antonescu and Stănculescu both talk about this, keep them healthy so they can work productively, because they need the labor. Interestingly, you even see them deployed in labor units alongside Jewish forced laborers, which is what I wrote my first book about, was the Jewish forced labor units in Romania. And yeah, they work alongside the Jews, interestingly enough.
And this is where it dissects slightly and goes down a different track to the Nazis themselves. I mean, I'm thinking of what Ed said yesterday about in Latvia when they're starting to use people they're capturing and the Jewish population for work, and then it becomes clear the orders come down. No, killing them is actually a priority. Forget about the works. So as Romania having a pragmatic, immediate, sort of short-term thing about, no, hang on, these people can work for us. But there's also been comments coming in the sidebar about the Third Reich of the Germany themselves have gone full in on the 1,000-year Reich. Nothing's going to come off. The wheels won't fall off this wagon. They're going to eliminate the Jews. They're going to eliminate the Soviet Union, and they're going to be, there for 1,000 years. Romania, this is what our viewers are suggesting, are much more aware that in some point in the future, they will have the Soviets on their doorstep again. And so we had the comment from Andreas in Germany that they sure had to take into account that the Soviets will come back one day, looking at their proximity to the Soviet Union. So there's an immediate reason to keep people alive for labor. But do you think they're also thinking long term that if the Germans' plan goes tits up, they're covering their asses?
I think that is less the case with Soviet POWs than it is with Jews. You actually do see this very, very clearly in Romanian Jewish policy. A large number of the Jews who are living in what's now Moldova, as well as the portions of present-day Ukraine that were occupied by the Romanians, they're deported to what's known as the Transnistria Governorate, an area of occupied Ukraine it's between the Dniester and the Bug rivers. It includes the city of Odessa and the areas to the north and west of there. Jews from present-day Moldova and what's now a region known as Bukovina, which is now mostly part of Ukraine, around the city of Chernivtsi, they are deported to that area. They die in large numbers, along with the local Ukrainian Jews who live there. The Jews living within the Romanian Old Kingdom are mostly spared this fate. Now, the Romanians have their own long-term plans to deport the Jews from what's called the Old Kingdom to Transnistria, or something like that, a permanent solution. And they specifically say forced labor is a temporary solution while we enact this permanent solution. They're also negotiating with the Germans to participate in the German final solution. And they have plans in place in the summer of 42 to deport the Jews of Romania to Belzec, to the extermination camp in occupied Poland there. And these plans fall through in the fall of 42. Well, what's going on in the fall of 42? How is the war going in the fall of 42? How's the war going for the Romanians in the fall of 42? Exactly. So the Romanians are very much making this kind of realpolitik calculation that, well, if we deport the Jews now and we end up losing the war, that's not going to go well for us. This also ties into Antonescu having these beliefs that the Jews run, not just the Soviet Union, but the Western capitalist democracies. They're all run by the, Jews, crazy anti-Semitic stuff. So, yeah, I think that's less the case with the Soviet prisoners. I think that they're more or less just taking a more pragmatic line from the beginning than the Germans, because while they're ideologically aligned with the Germans, they're not necessarily as ideologically driven in their policy towards prisoners of war.
I think we've had it when we had Grant on in the past. When we're talking about it's more like their ideologies are in parallel rather than being the same. There are things where they are in alignment, and there are things where it separates quite distinctly, because there are different people. And I've had this conversation with Roger Morehouse, for example, in the UK, about how Romania and Hungary define themselves, how they define other peoples next to them, and it varies within the country. Within, like within Poland, there's the various factions of Poles who have different opinions about the other factions of Poles. So the point I'm making is, putting a wide brush across German policy and assuming it's all the same and in line is clearly not the case. It's much more complicated and nuanced.
Yeah, and that's very much the case in Romania, and Grant has done a great job of outlining this in his book, how, the motivations, for the Romanian troops and stuff like that. This book's fantastic. Definitely pick his book up and read it. So Romania is not necessarily pursuing this sort of like Nazified ideological goal of colonizing the East and exterminating the people who live there, right? They don't have this motivation, and they also, so they're just taking on this somewhat more pragmatic line towards Soviet prisoners, whatever their views of them ideologically, and they do have their suspicions because of their, shared belief in this idea of Judeo-Bolshevism and all of this, but it is a more pragmatic line.
We have to, I keep interrupting you, Dallas. We have to remind ourselves as well is that those countries that are in that part of the world, say Romania, Hungary, things like Bulgaria, they have to make some kind of decision. There's a war erupting around them. They can't all play the Switzerland. Well, it's not my part. They can't play that card. So they have to kind of go in with one or other.
And in Romania's case,
that are there.
And
in some cases, they change as the war goes on.
Yeah, in Romania's case, they didn't really get a choice because the Soviets annexed significant parts of Romanian territory in June of 1940 as part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Yeah. So they're pushed into the Axis camp more or less by default at that point. They had already been moving towards a rapprochement with Germany and stuff like that. But and then of course, after the Soviet invasion in August of 1944, they switched sides again. They switched sides and joined the Allies. But I do want to get to the American prisoners of war.
Please do.
As well. The vast majority of the American prisoners of war are there because they were shot down during Operation Tidal Wave. I don't know if you've covered Tidal Wave on the show before, but just as a very broad overview for people, Romania, like I mentioned, was providing about a quarter to a third of the oil for Germany during the war from the Romanian oil fields, which are located mostly around the city of Ploiești, which is sort of northwest of Bucharest. So they're an important part of the Axis coalition because they have oil supplies. And the Americans and British want to obviously destroy these oil supplies, but they don't have a great way of doing it in 42 and 43 because Romania is a long way away from any Allied occupied territory at that point. They've been pushed out of Greece. That was part of Hitler's rationale for Marita for the invasion of Greece, was to make sure the British don't have access to those airfields so they can't bomb the Romanian oil fields. So there was an early attempt to launch bombers from Egypt and do it that way, called the Halverson Project in I think June of 42. That didn't really do much. The Tidal Wave is a much, much larger project conducted by the 8th Air Force in August of 43. They're launching from airfields near Benghazi in Libya. They're going to fly basically up across the Mediterranean, up the Adriatic coast, and then over Bulgaria to Romania and bomb the oil fields in Ploiești, and then fly back via back over Turkey and back to the Allied held airfields in the Middle East. So this is an ambitious plan, to say the least, and they're doing this with B-24 Liberators. So they're really pushing the fuel economy of a B-24 Liberator to do this. And part of the plan is that to avoid getting shredded by the very extensive German-Romanian combined air defenses at Ploiești, because the Germans put a lot of effort into fortifying this area to protect the oil for obvious reasons. So there's really strong anti-aircraft defenses there. They're going to fly in low, really low, right above the ground to avoid radar detection and try to, avoid getting, avoid the Germans activating their air defenses until the last possible second. This doesn't work. obviously, the Bulgarians picked them up. First of all, the Bulgarians picked them up. The Bulgarians, I think, shoot down a couple of bombers, but more to the point, they know they're coming now. So they're able to scramble their fighter defenses, and the bombers flying at low level like that are obviously sitting ducks for any kind of prepared anti-aircraft defenses. So they get absolutely shredded. The Romanians lose, I don't know, I want to say something like 30% of the capacity of the refineries there get damaged, but they're repaired within, a few months back to producing at or above the levels they were at during tidal wave. So this is there are, I think, 5 medals of honor handed out during this, 3 of which were posthumous, if I remember correctly. So yeah, this is a massive it's referred to as like Black Sunday or whatever because of how heavy the losses were for the Americans. But those who were shot down and survived are taken to the camp you see here. This is a place called Timișul de Jos, which is located near the city of Brașov in central Romania. You can see the green circle with the 2 there. And this camp is referred to by the American prisoners as the Gilded Cage because they're kept in very good conditions. They're visited by Romanian dignitaries, including members of the Romanian royal family. They're kept in by prisoner of war camp standards, luxurious conditions. Interestingly, there are actually some Soviet prisoners who were recruited as orderlies to basically work in these camps. I was talking to Grant about this just the other day, actually, and some of them didn't want to go back because they liked even serving, basically being a servant in the American camps. They were still living better than they would have in the Soviet camps. But this is, I think, a reflection kind of again realpolitik on the part of the Antonescu government because again these guys are captured in August of 43. The Kursk offensive has already been, is already falling apart at that point. The Germans are getting trounced. This is obviously going to go badly. The Romanian 3rd and 4th armies are, had already largely been destroyed at Stalingrad. So they've largely, they've had to kind of rebuild their armies almost essentially from scratch. It's very obvious where the war is going at this point. So making friends with the Americans, who the Romanians never had much interest in fighting a war with to begin with, makes sense because any favor that you can curry with the Western allies is going to help you when not if, the Soviets occupy Romania. Yep. So, and this is around the time when the Romanians start working the back channels and trying to feel out the possibility of a separate peace with the Western allies, which never really comes to fruition. Partially because the Western, the Allies argue basically we can't make a separate peace with the Soviets. This would run contrary to our agreements with the Soviets. You have to meet their conditions as well as ours, and that ultimately doesn't happen. So the Antonescu regime remains in power until August of 44 when the Soviet invasion comes, and then they're finally toppled by a coup d'etat in August of 44. But during this period between August of 43 and August of 44, they make a point of treating the American prisoners as well as possible because they would like to get as much favor as they can with the Western allies during this period when they, are going to rely on them politically. There's actually a pretty interesting thing that happens when it becomes clear the Soviets are about to occupy Romania. There's an extensive plan to evacuate the American prisoners out to Italy. Which happens, the Americans conduct this like basically airlift to bring these prisoners back from Romania to Italy in the summer of 44. There's a good film on it that I don't think is available anywhere publicly, but you can see it at the National Archives. I forget the name of the film. I should have written that down. But yeah, so again, you have
well on there, I can't think about. I know the title, but I can't think what it is. But yeah,
I know. Yeah.
And by the way, folks, I put the link in the sidebar to the show from a couple of years ago with Luke Truxell about the operation, the bombing of the oil fields. So I put that in the sidebar, and I'll add it to the link later on. So yeah,
I wasn't sure if you had covered that or not. That's good. So again, as with the Soviet prisoners, this is much more driven by pragmatic political concerns than by pure ideological factors. So you have a policy that's a lot more pragmatic than the German policy, even towards Western Allied prisoners of war. So the importance of nationality is still here in the Romanian case, although it's less based on racial political ideology than it is based on what is in Romania's best interest politically. And I do want to draw attention to the fact, again, this is kind of the central argument that I make in my chapter. I don't really talk about American prisoners that much there, but I do want to, again, make the central point that, like, this sort of pragmatism and concern for what is going to suit the Romanian state at the moment is ultimately what distinguishes Romanian and German policy, particularly towards Soviet prisoners of war, where the economic exploitation of the prisoners for forced labor is what ultimately prevents them from meeting the same fate as the Soviet prisoners in German captivity. So that's just about everything I had in my notes. So if people have questions, you or anyone else has questions.
I mean, brilliant stuff. And apologies for interrupting you so much. So
no.
We have an idea, again, slightly from war films, is the undermanning in terms of the number of guards and staff at Allied prisoner of war camps. In your research, is there a particular country or part of the war where that was more of a problem than other parts? You know, I mean, I can imagine as the war goes on, anyone who's vaguely able to carry a rifle gun and get sent to the front. And I know when we've done shows about the death marches, you know, there's almost empathy between the guards, who are the old Germans, and the prisoners themselves, because they're all dealing with hunger, they're all dealing with that. But is undermanning a problem that gets worse from the German point of view?
Yeah, towards the end of the war, you do run into this because they're running out of people, essentially, because the camp staff officers are generally older guys who weren't going to be able to be sent to the front. These are guys, you know, like I said, who are, 40 plus years old. But the people who guard the camps are often reservists, members of what's called the Landesschützen. So essentially like militia, local militia and things like that aren't members of the regular army. But by the time you get to the late period of the war, they're, more of these guys have to be recruited into the actual army because they are in a situation, a desperate life and death situation. So you have fewer and fewer people able to guard the camps, which you also have fewer and fewer people able to staff the camps, which goes back to what I said earlier about the system starting to break down and stuff like that. So this isn't like, oh, the guards are gone, or they don't have many guards, we can run away and escape. There's not many people running this camp. We might not get food today. More of that kind of thing, essentially.
Thank you. I'm gonna put your map up again now because there's a good question from Ian Carr really early on in the show. The map there. Obviously, there are certain parts of Germany, particularly where maybe even as close as yards apart, you've got a camp with British prisoners close to a camp with Soviet prisoners.
Yeah.
And so Ian is asking, when POW, US, and British force camps were adjacent but separate to the Soviet, that must have multiplied issues. Were the guards separate forces? I mean, to expand on that, would that mean that the policies would be sort of separate from the Soviet camp on the left-hand side of the road to the camp of Brits and French on the right-hand side of the road? Is there any kind of research into that being a better situation or more complicated? Or
so, I mean, that's in some cases that's literally true. That the policy on one side of the road is different from the other because you have. In a lot of cases, like I mentioned, some of the camps were solely for Soviet prisoners, but others were that held all of the groups. And prisoners of different nationalities were separated. This was not just a German thing. This was a requirement of the Geneva Convention to keep the national group separated. So you would have an American compound, a British compound, a French compound, a Soviet compound, whatever other nationalities there might be there within one main camp. And the policies were different. The amount of food allocated to the prisoners was different. The way that the guards treated the prisoners was different within this same camp, but divided into these different compounds. And there are cases, this is something I'd really like to find more information on. But I found a few cases in the archives of American prisoners who were in camps where the American sector bordered the Soviet sector, and they were aware of the situation of the Soviet prisoners and saw how they were living and, would make arrangements to throw food over the fence or trade food for cigarettes or whatever, and at least some effort to kind of help them a little bit. This was officially discouraged by the Germans, and the Germans actually occasionally shot at people for doing this. But this is that's actually something I would like to find more on, that I'm hoping to find more on in the course of my research. I found a few examples, but I would like to know more, because obviously the prisoners in these neighboring compounds had to be aware of how the Germans were treating the Soviets. So those perceptions and those efforts at aid, I think, are an interesting subject for further research. But yeah, it's going to be conditioned on me finding more sources in the archives, I guess. Yeah, but to the question, yes, you do have quite literally cases where the policy towards the prisoners is different on opposite sides of the road.
Wow. This is a brilliant question. I really like this one from David Levine here. Were there any German soldiers or officers that protested against the mistreatment of POWs? Because, although we're not going to go along with the clean Wehrmacht myth, and yes, of course, most of the German country and organization was at least part of the horrors. But when you get men who fought in combat, and you mentioned some of the senior members of staff who perhaps fought in the First World War, they've been on the front lines themselves. Were there cases of German officers saying, hang on, you can't treat the French like this, you can't treat the British or even the Soviets like this?
So it's interesting. I want to preface this by saying that at the very top levels, at the staff levels, there is very little opposition to things like the Commissar order. These orders are handed down and they're given to almost every unit by the staff officers and the commanding officers without questioning it. Some of the officers even drew up their own versions of these instructions to make them, their own, so to speak. So at the top levels, there is a broad consensus even about the criminal aspects of the treatment of Soviet prisoners. That said, the Wehrmacht is huge. The officer corps is huge. It's heterogeneous. It's not a monolith. There are individual officers who oppose the execution of commissars and don't order their units to do it. Although in some cases, Felix Roma wrote a good book in German. It hasn't been translated into English, just called Der Kommissarbefehl, about the Commissar order. He notes that even in cases where officers told their troops not to execute the Soviet commissars, some of them did it anyway, just because they had been, really instilled with propaganda about the dangers of the commissars and did it even without orders. But there were officers who did not pass down that order, and there were officers. A notable example is Stalag 7A in Moosburg, which is the largest prisoner of war camp in Germany, held a large number of American prisoners, so it's pretty well known in the West. The officers there actually did object in in the fall of 41, when the Gestapo was coming in to select political commissars and Jews and so forth from among the Soviet prisoners. They say, no, we're not going to let you do that. And what ultimately happens is, kind of predictably, they're not disciplined for it. Officers who did this stuff were generally not disciplined for it. Like, nobody got shot for insubordination for doing this, but they were reassigned somewhere else, or they were sent to the reserve, basically. And that's what happened to the guys at Stalag 7A. They were sent to the reserve. Someone more pliant was put in place, and then the executions continued. So there were certainly people who opposed this policy on moral grounds. As you get further into the war, you start to encounter people who begin to oppose it on more practical grounds. So the Commissar order in particular is rescinded on May 6, 1942. The reason for that is not because the Germans suddenly decided, oh, this is a violation of international law, we should stop doing this, it's bad, after doing it for a year. What happened is they started to realize, oh, the fact that these guys know now, because obviously word gets out about this in the Soviet forces from escaped prisoners of war and so forth, that the Germans are shooting the commissars when they're captured. And they start telling, these guys realize, oh, well, if we surrender, we're going to get shot. So we're not going to surrender, and we're not going to let the men in our unit surrender either. And they start, resisting, more fervently. They fight to the death in situations where they might otherwise surrender. And this produces huge German casualties beyond, if these guys had surrendered, fewer Germans would be getting killed than if they, if they fight to the death, essentially. So the Germans, especially as you get into 42 and you're starting to get, really, really heavy German losses, they're losing the cream of the crop of their troops. They're having to, and they're getting to the point where they can't replace their losses. a lot of the staff officers, some of them had expressed these concerns as early as like September of 41, but they start to gain a voice in the spring of 42. There's some momentum to change this policy, and eventually at the beginning of May, Hitler agrees and they change the policy. So you see a lot more advocacy against the mistreatment of prisoners of war from a pragmatic standpoint of reducing German losses than you do from a moral standpoint. And as I mentioned before, in the case of Western Allied prisoners, there's no policy of systematic mistreatment, but there is always this concern in the back of the minds of the Germans that if they mistreat, especially British and American prisoners, there could be ramifications for German prisoners in British and American captivity. So they have to kind of watch themselves a little bit, and this does constrain their action towards those prisoners. So,
well, I mean, brilliant response to that, and I think you've done what I wanted you to do, and what you said you were going to, which is have a foot in all of those camps, so to speak, pun intended, of the economic policies, the political picture, the pragmatic picture, and then the actual policies under the POW camps themselves, and the overlaps, because we're doing a more conventional Operation Barbarossa show tomorrow with Richard Hargreaves. But when people are watching that, or they're reading a book about the tank divisions pushing over bridges, this policy decision is all lurking in the background. The notion of food, the notion of the fact that they're taking prisoners, the ideology that you can't separate it from, the fact, as you reminded us, that the Holocaust per se and the POW camps are separate, but also have a huge overlap as well. It's that you can't study any one of these things without at least understanding the others, because it all overlaps. And I think when we talk about the Americans, historians looking at, for example, the American efforts in the Pacific in 1944, and the movement of drinking water across the island hopping campaign, which were massive, great issues for the Americans and Brits to deal with. But I guess at the heart, the British and Americans aren't dealing with the same logistics problems caused by the prisoners they're taking. They've got the infrastructure broadly to accommodate it and just sort of deal with it and not have to go down not have to go. How am I going with this? But the maltreatment that you're saying that can be ideologically based, but it can also just be restriction and lack of resources based. So yeah, very complicated subject, but really thank you for dealing with it and unraveling it for us. So brilliant. Well, I think we'll think about inviting you back and talking about one of your previous books in another show in the future. But in the meantime, that's been really fantastic talking to you, folks. As I said, 2 shows coming tomorrow. We've got the Operation Barbarossa one, then Maris Dallas's colleague is coming on to talk about particularly or expand on the Soviet POWs in German hands. So it's been fantastic talking to you, Dallas. As always, folks, click like and subscribe, buy my guest books, visit their websites, read their blogs, etc., so they all do more work and create us more World War II content to get excited about. I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Cheers, Dallas. Bye.
Bye.